Hi everyone, welcome to North and South Pot. This is a politics podcast. As you know, there's a general election coming up. Don't know if you've heard that or not. And I've got someone on who I've been meaning to get on for a while, who lives locally in Bootle. He's very much involved in what might be called independent, left-leaning politics, and that's Ralph James.
Hi folks.
Is a former councillor. We'll talk about that in a moment. But Ralph, you're standing in this coming election. Do you want to tell us briefly about that before we get into the details?
Yes, I'm 70 and I've got a number of health problems, age-related, but I didn't feel, particularly with my experience of having been arguably the first Labour councillor in Crosby, certainly one of the first three in Crosby constituency in the year of the poll tax 1990, and I doubled my majority in office in what had been a safe Tory ward. I then resigned from the Labour Party because of Blair's foreign policy, supporting the genocide against the East Timorese by the Indonesians and selling them warplanes. And I found it totally ethically unacceptable because I'd actually been in court a couple of years earlier when 4 women peace activists had got off with a charge of damaging a previous batch of these warplanes made in Preston at BAE, having as their defence that they were preventing a greater crime, which was that of mass murder. They admitted the vandalism to the planes and they opted for trial by jury of their peers. And the jury of their peers took the same view that the peace activists took, that they were justified in doing what they'd done, so they got off with it. Fast forward to when I was a councillor and I was coming up for re-election for a third term of office after Blair's general election victory of June 1997. It was August and Robin Cook, who was a newly installed Foreign Secretary, announced on the news that the incoming Labour government were to export another batch of these planes. And I immediately decided that I'd had enough of Blair's so-called ethical foreign policy and enough of Blair generally. And I went up promptly to the chief executive in Sefton Council in the town hall in Southport, and I resigned from office and had a syndicated open letter of resignation ripping the back out of Blair and his Tory with red paint on policies. And I resigned from both office and also from the Labour Party. I then, after about a 6-month interval, was persuaded to join the then new Socialist Labour Party, which was being headed up by Arthur Scargill, and I stood as a candidate in the ward which I had taken for Labour as an SLP alternative.
Just to let people know, Arthur Scargill was the leader of the miners' union in the 80s. He was very, very famous in the 80s, just for younger listeners, as it were.
Well, ironically, it was actually the miners' strike that caused me to join the Labour Party in the first place. I was brought up in a very highly politicised household, although my dad never held public elected office, but he was chair of his union branch, which was then called the National Association of Operative Plasterers, and political issues and moral issues generally were always talked about round the house, so the microculture was conducive to developing a very highly opinionated view of the way the world worked and the relevance of what was right and wrong in the world to every individual.
Can I just say that is exactly how I was raised? And I've spoken about this before. When I was growing up, my dad had pictures of Lenin and Stalin. Not so much as if he was a complete admirer of those people, but he was very much interested in the idea of communism. Although my mum and dad might say that the socialists, my dad always flirted with the idea of communism, and it's something that me and him have disagreed with. But I was certainly raised in a very similar background. Pray continue.
As I say, broadening it out beyond any particular political ideology, the rights and wrongs of things were discussed all around the house. There's one rather amusing incident which I remember as being sort of quasi Groundhog Day, where my father used to go and see my uncle, who had become a Tory, and my uncle in his earlier life had been a radical lefty, and as though they were both trying to battle for my soul, my uncle and my father got into a dispute about whether one should try to maintain one's principles or whether one should, as it were, get real about the way the world worked. And my uncle said to me famously, in my memory, if you're not a communist at 18, you've got no heart, and if you haven't grown out of it by the time you're 30, then you haven't grown up. Eventually, this ended up with my dad saying, he's a traitor to his class, son, we're off. And as I say, I remember that as though it happened every Christmas, but it was probably only one Christmas. But it gives you some indication of the degree of passion with which the ethics of anything you care to mention, from a cup of tea to the World War II, were discussed. Both my uncle and my father were in the Royal Navy during the war, and my dad often related his war experiences, but it was always in the context of the futility of war, and he'd seen some horrible things, and also of man's inhumanity to man, and the need to learn moral lessons. He was torpedoed, and he was also very nearly kamikaze attacked when he was on an aircraft carrier, and those two incidents were to him exemplary of the sort of moral points that he was making. A good example of this was when my dad was on his first ship in the North Atlantic, which was a fighter-carrying, catapult-launched convoy defence vessel. And on this particular occasion, a long-range German bomber, which was the biggest threat to convoys at that time in the war, was sighted, and one of these fighters was launched by steam catapult. The fighter itself was lost, but the pilot was picked up, and then they used another plane. It was expendable. It was very much an emergency stopgap measure. Anyway, on this particular occasion, the fighter engaged and shot down the four-engine bomber, and my dad had been on an anti-aircraft gun trying to do the same thing. When the German bomber ditched, it was a converted passenger plane, and its ditching characteristics were extremely poor. And he said in the space of 5 minutes, the crew went from trying to kill the German crew to imploring them and willing them to get out of the crashed plane, and they actually watched the German crew drown. But the way the sentiments of the erstwhile enemies changed, he said it just made you realise that under the skin we're all human beings. Yeah. And that made a big impression on me.
That's massive. Can I just ask where the kamikaze thing was?
Right, the kamikaze. My dad.
I'm thinking Asian.
Yeah,
Pacific.
My dad had the most incredible, surreal war because he met Hollywood A-list stars while he was waiting for a ship to be commissioned. Well, a ship to be commissioned. He was on 3 ships. One was torpedoed in the invasion of North Africa. That was the one after the one I've just told you about, the incident with the bomber. And then he was sent to America, where he spent 12 months waiting for a new ship to be commissioned and built by the Americans, Rosie the Riveter and co., who were throwing them out every couple of days. And it was a ship built to US specifications. It was known as an attack class escort carrier, and he joined that ship as the captain's tiger, as they called it. He was the captain's personal steward, for which he was ideally temperamentally suited. He was playing a sort of a Jeeves to the captain's Wooster, because a couple of the captains he was with were alcoholics. Anyway, they sailed with a number of incidents which I won't relate to what was then known as Ceylon, and they were in a deep water harbour in a place called Trincomalee. At one stage, they were launching operations against, I think it was Malaysia, against the Japanese. And right at the end of the war, this is another example of the futility of war that I was, had related to me. It was probably after the first atom bomb was dropped, but they didn't know that. And a Japanese kamikaze got within 500 yards of the aircraft carrier, and they shot it down. Now, my dad said to me, he didn't know that the war was over, it was about to end, but that Japanese crew died for nothing, because the outcome of the war was already determined. And had they blown the aircraft carrier up, well, for a start, I wouldn't be here. But also, that crew would have died for nothing.
It's crazy, isn't it, to think about it? Now, we've discussed off mic before about doing a podcast in the future about food and ethics. And stuff. And I think there's some real history there. I think that might be interesting to get recorded, because I did a podcast with me featuring me Nan Elizabeth, who died in 2016, about her experiences of the Blitz. That's now going, that history, that kind of oral history.
Absolutely.
I think it'd be good to get that recorded in its own right. But it's fair to say you were raised in a political home, an ethical home, where ethics and morality were discussed at the kitchen table and the dining table, and that it was very much a kind of futility of war situation based on the war, which is something I got from my granddad as well. He wasn't really proud of what happened, but he did relate what happened during the war. Now, just to draw this back, you are standing in central Sefton. By the way, there's coffee and water there.
Sefton Central is not central.
I always say it the other way around. So Sefton, for listeners who don't know, is just north of Liverpool, and it's a county borough. Where we are, Bootle is very much a Labour stronghold, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And as Ralph said, even areas like Crosby, just north of Bootle, have become more Labour in recent years. And Central Sefton, have I said it wrong? Sefton Central is currently a Labour seat with Bill Esterson. So are you standing in that constituency seat?
Very much so. I think I mentioned earlier that I was actually technically the first Labour councillor in Crosby proper. In 1990, the year of the poll tax, we took, the Labour group that is, took 3 seats outside Bootle in Sefton for the first time. 2 of them were in Crosby constituency, but in Maghull, which was part of that constituency and still is. And I took the first seat in Manor Ward, which was basically Thornton and Hightown, roughly speaking. It was considered to be a Tory stronghold, and indeed, in the previous by-election, I think late 88, we'd lost by about 500 votes. I won with a majority of about 560 to 80, which I managed to increase in office, which I'm very proud of, to 1,150, which was 50.8, I think it is, percentage of votes cast overall, which was an absolute majority. And my proudest addition to that related series of facts is that it was not under Tony Blair. It was the one year that John Smith was the party leader, somebody who I greatly respected and admired, because he has something that I believe has gone out of British politics, and that was compassion and integrity.
Now, I'm just looking at the Get Voting website, and I would urge everyone out, check out the Get Voting website, and we're going to get to this issue at the moment between what might be called, there was an interesting article in The Observer last week by someone saying you need to vote tactically and the left shouldn't divide itself. And there were 2 letters, one coming in saying, well, people vote with principles, it's the voting system that's wrong. And another one saying we need to vote tactically to get rid of the Tory government, etc. And we're going to cover those issues in a minute. Now, at the moment, Sefton Central, tactical voting, there's no advice on what to do here. In Bootle, where we are, it's 100% Labour. Yeah. It's. I think it was the safest Labour seat in the country, and it used to be, I think, the safest seat in the country, although that might have changed.
I would like to cut in and say that I was actually literally crying to see, given what I believe will be attempted with regards to the relaxation of particularly planning controls on the Freeport. I was crying when I found out that Labour had deservedly, morally, lost Church Ward to the Greens. And I'm not particularly an advocate of the Greens as a party, but I happen to like the candidate locally. I think he's a man of principle. And I won't say anything about the Labour councillor who lost, except that he is supporting a non-alternative to the Tories in Starmer's Labour Party. I believe that if you want Blair to get a 4th term of office, vote for Starmer and his minions. And what they've done over the support for the barbarity in Palestine, whatever the pious mutterings they may be coming out with now about humanitarian intervention and ceasefires, I think it is utterly cynical. I was motivated in no small measure to throw my hat in the ring, as it were, at my age, after having been out of active candidature, although I've been involved in campaigns as it were, a manager recently, because of primarily the issue of the genocide of the Palestinians, about which I feel extremely strongly.
We'll come to the Palestinian debate later, if you like. It's something that I've always followed since I studied politics at uni, because I think in this country, with the Balfour Declaration and our history, there is a bit of a we used to be in there before this situation arose as a British person. Now, around the world, the Palestinian-Israel conflict causes a lot of divisions, a lot of issues relating to perceptions of the past, etc. And I think that the big issue with that is a lot of people say there's other things going on, and you can quite rightly say, like, yeah, there's terrible situation in Sudan at the moment. You've got the situation in Ukraine. There's a lot of stuff you don't hear about because it's happening within what might be called a sovereign state, as it were.
Absolutely.
But the Palestinian issue, Israel-Palestine, is very much a blot on the conscience of the world in terms of how it's perceived, I think. And there's so much nonsense going on in the debates at the moment where your opinions on a protest in the United States or the opinions of a particular group in the UK seems to be becoming more important than actually what's happening in the ground in Israel, Palestine, and particularly in Gaza. So, I mean, I've heard lots of people talking about it, and they're going, oh, yeah, you know, and you go, well, what's happening in Gaza at the moment? And all these debates, we need to talk about the situation on the ground, what can be changed, and what we can do to make things better. And this is a big thing for people on the Labour left. It's a bit of an open wound in the UK because of our imperial past, as it were. And this is a big issue for people. And I've heard people talking about this locally. Everyone's got an opinion on it. And it's very much a big and live issue in British politics at the moment. The SNP have took a particular stand on it. Labour have struggled to come up with things, as they've struggled with the treatments of so-called left-wingers in the party. I think the Labour Party have had a really bad week in terms of their attempts to stifle differences. And then the traditional Tory position, default, whatever the Israelis are doing is kind of okay. Now, a lot of people say Starmer needs to fight back against this label of anti-Semitism. And one thing that's really shocked me is the inability of the Labour Party to sit down and say, right, we've been accused of being anti-Semitic. What are the things which are leading to that? What are the words and phrases which might be perceived as anti-Semitic? Let's isolate those and say, OK, we won't use those phrases, we'll put it this way. And let's get a line and a position on it. And they seem unable to do that. What are your thoughts?
I think the whole idea of labelling people in the Labour Party anti-Semitic was trumped up in the first place. Certainly with regards to Corbyn, it was used to calumniate him systematically and to undermine him. I recently saw a 5-page article including 2 full-page colour photographs of Starmer and his wife in Vogue magazine, which was being sold cheap that month, March. On, I think it was page 228, but it was a 5-page article including 2 full-page colour photographs about how he saved the Labour Party from Corbyn and anti-Semitism. Now, so far as I'm concerned, I think it's worth bearing in mind that even at its most radical, the post-war Labour Party under Attlee, it was on their watch that what the Palestinians called the Nakba happened, which was self-declared independence by Israel and the expropriation of the land and the systematic abuse of the people of Palestine.
And that led to 700,000 Palestinians being ethnically cleansed.
Well, that's what I would call it, certainly. But there is now a culture where if you say ethnically cleansed, you're immediately accused of being anti-Semitic just for saying it.
That's true, and that needs to be pushed back on. And I think we can both comfortably say that acknowledging that and saying that was ethnic cleansing is not anti-Semitic.
I can't think of any other factual way of describing it.
No.
To me, I think it's a tragic fact that violence begets violence, and that the only thing I find that is directly comparable to what we're witnessing in terms of the use of industrial technology to perpetrate a genocide is the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto by the Nazis in 1944. I think there is a very, very close comparison between the way Netanyahu's government, and I don't mean all Jewish people, I mean Netanyahu's government, and bear in mind he's trying to distract his own public away from his own criminality, apart from his war criminality. And I think that the people who claim to represent all Jewish people are misrepresenting the thing to such an extent that certainly Jewish friends of mine who are involved with the Friends of Palestine movement find completely bewildering and extremely distressing.
Yeah. I think one of the other issues is, again, we were talking about history earlier, and there's a great book at the moment called The Holocaust by Dan Stone, and he discusses how the Holocaust is still often used by people on the right to assert Israeli sovereignty over non-Israeli land. I think that's the best way of putting it. So, for example, the settler movement, since the 70s, I think, I might be wrong, it might have been earlier, governments in Israel found it politically expedient to turn a blind eye to the settlers who were going into the occupied territory.
But if I may interrupt,
and even to then actively encourage them, go there and visit them for political reasons.
I think, for a start, I would not accept the use of the word settlers. They are occupiers.
Oh, yeah.
Under international law, I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. Under international law, they are on land which is illegally occupied.
Yes.
There's no other way to say it. And that is an open wound that keeps getting worse. Now, we've had this discussion before. I'm interested in this situation. I've read a great book called Israel-Palestine by a local Liverpool historian. I'm going to tell you his name, actually. Ian Carroll wrote a great book on the history of Israel and Palestine. And one of the interesting things is he goes back far enough in history and he actually sees that they were effectively the same people from the same land, and then this division of religion comes in, which then centuries later, develops, and all of a sudden you've got people who don't like each other because of this fear of the other kind of thing, which comes back to what we said earlier about man's inhumanity to man.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I found when I've done a podcast about Israel-Palestine about 5 months ago, is when it came to the conclusion, I just quoted Kennedy saying, we're all mortal, we're all human, and we need to live side by side. And all these artificial divisions, you can justify a position till the cows come home, but it's not really how we're going to make the situation better, is it?
We need some sort of change from the overall glass half empty negativity of our worldview now to a more positive conception of how society should aim for its goals, which are life-enhancing rather than death-enhancing. And unfortunately, nothing makes more money than war. The love of money, as it says in the Bible, the love of money is the root of all evil, and I couldn't agree with that more. And some people would describe that as translating in terms of class war. Some people would say it's a battle between good and evil in some disembodied sense. Whichever way you look at it, you can only either have the glass half empty or half full. You can't have both. You can't perceive it. And for example, in the 60s, a number of shop stewards came up with a thing called the Lucas Plan, where they gave suggestions as to how industrial processes, a sort of modern version of swords into ploughshares, could be transferred from war production to production of things like kidney dialysis machines and whatever. And they actually costed it. And although it was economically viable, it was sat on by the establishment because it wasn't to do with the war industry. And I think we have to really see, especially with the way the planet's creaking environmentally, we have to really think seriously about the role that humanity has as custodian of the planet, particularly in its capacity to forward plan and to forward plan mass slaughter, both of us and the animals. Because I'm very interested in animal welfare, animal rights. A number of the sages down the ages, from Aristotle to Leonardo da Vinci to Percy Shelley, and even Albert Einstein, have both said that there should come a time when we're properly civilised, where the killing of animals is as abhorrent to people as the killing of people by people. And I thoroughly subscribe to that view, and I think it's very interesting that some of the greatest minds in history have come to the same conclusion down the centuries.
Yeah, I'm the same. I've got a genetic illness, and for environmental and ethical reasons, I eat fish still, even though there is big issues with that.
Don't ever eat anything with a face.
And I avoid dairy products. And a lot of people who push back and resist that, it's almost like a kind of Jeremy Clarkson kind of like Nigel Farage response seems to be the default. And again, if it's like Plato's cave, if you've been raised to just look at the shadows at the back of the wall, people are raised with meat. And that's the way it is. And yet we need protein. So we can actually come up with ways now which can... Can
I just say, Tim, that I think one of the greatest reasons for hope is the capacity for human beings to reprogram. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't always a vegetarian. I'm a vegan now, but I wasn't always a vegetarian. And for quite a large part of my life, I was an omnivore. And I didn't give up eating animals because I didn't like the taste of them anymore. I had a healthy palate, across the range of foodstuffs. But I eventually was confronted with the moral reality that it's wrong. And that the idea, because you don't say it, Paul McCartney said, for example, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Paul for taking the knighthood for a start, but he did say a couple of things that resonated with me. He said if abattoirs have glass walls, there'd be a lot of vegetarians around. And I think he made a really good point about that, because the whole process of slaughter is sanitised and people are kept away from the reality of it.
Absolutely. I think we mentioned this earlier about how, because of the sophistication of globalisation and supply networks, etc., it's very hard to know the impact of your actions because things are so multi-layered and multi-levelled. And in the past, you might have said, well, if you make that decision, it's quite clear what the consequences are. Nowadays, it's very difficult because you don't know where a lot of the stuff you're getting is sourced from and what's gone into it. I remember a statistic by Moby, who's a dance artist. He makes dance music. And he said that, I think something like 98% or 96% of animal inspectors in the United States didn't eat meat. And again, a lot of people say, I don't want to know this and I don't want to know that. And you're thinking, well, why not? If the reality of the situation might change your opinion, why wouldn't you want to know that information and then make a decision? Now, you get a lot of people who say, I don't like vegans, the way when you're out with them and they tell you why they don't eat meat, etc. and all that. And I go, okay, fair enough if you don't want to hear it, or you think it's a bit repetitive, or you think they're taking a moral stand in a world where you could find holes in their lifestyle if you just look at certain things that they do. Maybe vegans are still driving cars or whatever. But if you reduce everything to that, no one would take any action. And it's interesting how when people who are quite wealthy are conservative or right-wing, you go, oh, yeah, that's fine. When they come up with kind of left-wing proposals, you'd accuse them of being a champagne socialist. And again, it comes from that kind of Clarkson Faragist response to anything progressive. Do you know what I mean? That they just try to turn it round on you rather than saying, how can we as a human race move forward? And don't forget, the state and the governments of the world, whatever they do and invest in, that's where the private sector usually follows. And it's about how we do that more constructively. Go on.
I was just going to say, lifestyle. There's too much of an emphasis, in my opinion now, on a form of social engineering which grounds everything in terms of faults within the individual. For example, depression. I personally believe that this is probably... I'm an episodic depression sufferer all my life. But in this society, there are that many bad things going on around you that I think there's probably arguably something more wrong with you if it doesn't get to you. And you don't end up getting some sort of whatever you might describe with clinical labels as a mental illness or a mental distress. And I think we need to start asking much more fundamental questions about what sort of society that we make up collectively. And that involves political engagement. And there are many different processes I see being used. You may think I'm a mad conspiracy theorist, but in terms of the behavioural control of people, so that everything is reduced to an atomised single individual's perception of the world around them. It's a reversion to childhood almost.
Yeah.
Where, the child-centred universe rather than the more mature awareness of the holistic picture.
I mean... Conspiracy theory is one thing, but I remember reading George Ritz's excellent book in the 90s, The McDonaldization of Society, which is now called The McDonaldization Thesis. And in that book, he talks about... I did it as part of globalization and imperialism when it was at college and uni. And he talked about that, how we're becoming more individualised and more atomized. Not necessarily... because it's like a grand theory. In fact, at the end he addresses it. He says there are some people who say that there are elites who run the world and make these big decisions. He says, and there are others who say that the system itself has become so powerful that individuals can't control it, and all points in between. I'm not coming down one side of the fence or other. What we do know is that the net effect is that there's less community. People interact less. People view things very solipsistically compared to the past through an individual lens, etc., particularly in Western societies. And that does mean that there's more pressure on the individual. I think I listened to an excellent podcast recently about anxiety, and he was saying, oh, yeah, there's so many people with anxiety now for whatever reason. And the guy in it said, well, it's amazing that there's not more people who've got extreme anxiety given the pressures on life.
Absolutely.
And again, you might say, well, life's a lot better now than, say, it was 100 or 200 years ago materially, and in many ways that argument is correct. But the issue is, say in the United Kingdom now, if you are young, or even if you are an adult, if you don't own your home outright, housing is a very, very anxious issue.
Can I just interrupt there, Tim? This idea of home ownership is itself open to another way of looking at it. I do happen to own my home. I inherited it through my mum and dad. Most people are buying their own home, and there is no particular security in that, and there's getting to be less every day. And they can be repoed, or they can have to default on it for other reasons. They may lose their employment. And the other thing about it is that once you're involved in a mortgage, the system's got you where it wants you, because you're much less likely, or you've got another consideration if you wish to go against the grain in terms of your involvement in political activity potentially, or go on strike, or defend your workers' rights, whatever it happens to be. So this idea of home ownership, it needs a bit of a careful looking at, because you could argue it's a form of tied labour.
Absolutely, and effectively it's a form of serfdom.
Yeah.
In terms of the mortgage and the rental market in the UK at the moment, if you look at how things have changed in the last 20 years in terms of the costs of both of those things, that causes people anxiety and uncertainty. And in the United States, there was a statistic I read recently that 60% population in the US have not got any savings whatsoever. So 60% are one paycheck away from serious repercussions. And this is in the wealthiest, richest country in the world. Now, again, you've got to ask the question, what's going on? Why is that going on? Now, we can look at the Dutch housing system, the German housing system. We can look at the Scandinavian countries. And I often get a lot of pushback from people on the right. Not necessarily people on the right, because I don't interact with them as much. But people on the left who say, oh, you're an apologist for capitalism because you said that. And I said, well, no, I'm just saying that this idea that there's one type of market system is absurd. There's far better social models in places like Germany, the Netherlands, and across the Scandinavian countries, where all the indicators are those people are happier.
A lot of people were squawking about nationalisation years ago. And they used to say, I believe in the mixed economy. You didn't hear so much about people talking about the mixed economy when there was wholesale privatisation. In fact, the whole term mixed economies has been conveniently forgotten about now.
Blair was even talking about it as late as 94, 95, with his third way, with Anthony Giddens, that kind of mixed market approach. Now, you can look at some of the successes of what New Labour did when he came in. There's a lot of criticisms of private finance initiatives, the way that he cozied up to Murdoch. And I want to come back to this at the end about this. We can go there now if you like. There are people who say it's important to have principles, stand by your principles, even if in electoral systems like first past the post in the UK, you sometimes come short. There are others who say you have to try to get elected and then change things and then see where you go. You're then restricted by the Salisbury Convention, where if it's not in your manifesto in an election, the House of Lords can block it. Ironically, the House of Lords now seems like the Paris Commune compared to the way that the House of Commons has become in recent years, which I think is interesting. What are your views on the becoming a government first and foremost, i.e., that might necessitate cozying up to Murdoch, and this idea that you should stand by your principles and, if necessary, die by them?
There was a famous debate between Kinnock and somebody else where they said, Kinnock was saying that principles without power are idle sterility, I think he called it. And the person said back to him, and power without principle is unthinkable for a socialist, and I adhere to the latter view. One of the things I'll be campaigning for is constitutional change of various types. I'm an anti-monarchist. I'm quite unashamed of saying that, because I don't believe that the people's government should be the property of the monarch and their heirs and successors. And some of the people in the line of succession to the throne, which Charles has kept, frankly, don't seem to be a very good character. Andrew springs to mind. We could have a situation where all of the other contenders were actually taken out by some tragedy, and we were left with the likes of him as heir to the throne. And it brings into sharp relief the absurdity and the historical obsolescence of the idea of a constitutional monarchy, where the monarch is an unelected monarch is head of state. I would like to see grassroots democracy prevailing in terms of its manifestation in the representative democratic system. And with regards to what you're saying about cozying up to billionaires or whatever, I think a much more effective check and balance against that is the move to some form of proportional representation. I used to be an advocate of the first past the post system, but I think it's manifestly failed. George Galloway put it rather effectively, if somewhat, should we say, rustically, when he referred to two cheeks with regards to the two major parties. And I think we need to move away from the duopoly that is presently monopolising people's choices in the election, and it's one of the things that caused me to decide to stand as an independent. And I don't think I'll be by any means the only person, mainly from left-wing backgrounds, who will consider doing that.
I think it's interesting as well that the first past the post system, which we've got in the UK, the United States does it in the presidential elections.
Yeah.
They also have the electoral college, where whoever gets a majority in a state, all those electoral college votes go towards the president. And I think the first past the post system, I think there's only one other country in Europe that does it. I don't know if it's Belarus or Albania. I might need to check that. What it does is it means that you have a party which basically has, if it's got a decent majority, can do what it likes for a particular parliament of like 4 or 5 years, usually like maximum or whatever. But the first past the post system, it means that minority concerns are often pushed to the side, or even majority concerns, because you're trying to get a big enough minority to vote for you, which is what's happening. But the United States and the UK has shown that even with a first past the post system, you can still have a party or a president which can go really far to the extremes. And what some people are saying is if you have PR where it's more percentage-wise, it wouldn't be any worse, and at least every vote would count, and it's harder for people to influence elections, vested interests.
Yeah, at a very sort of high level of abstraction, I think we've got to bear in mind that we must examine the relationship between the individual conscience and the collective vote. And one of the things that worries me is that particularly the way things have gone recently, individuals are expected to subordinate their individual moral judgments to collective endeavour and the use of the whip. And I think that has got to be very carefully looked at, because if you look at the representation of the People's Act, for example, which has been in operation for about 100 years in this country, I could, when I resigned from office, have stayed a councillor, although I was elected as a Labour councillor, for the remaining period of office as an independent. I chose, because I believe in sticking to your principles, that as I was elected on a Labour ticket, I should, in honour, resign. But you don't have to do that, because, quite rightly, the Representation of the People's Act recognises that ultimately decision and responsibility are vested in the individual if they are elected as a representative. But you've then got the paradox of having to decide where your decisions in contrast, conscience, come so much into conflict with the collective will of the organisation on the back of which you've probably been elected, that resignation has to be a consideration as an option. And I think it's got to be said that for that reason, if resignation isn't in the locker as an extreme measure of any politician, they shouldn't be in public life if they've been elected on a party political platform, because it means that they're bought by the establishment of that party. And that's a form of fascism to me.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I find party discipline difficult.
Yes,
because there are sometimes principles that say, "Well, I don't agree with that." I might not necessarily resign, or
what I'm saying is that if it isn't your port of last resort,
okay,
you were basically bought. Your discretion is fettered to such an extent that you might as well be chained to the wall.
One thing, I used to be an active member of the National Education Union, and I used to do some casework for them. And I used to say to people who criticised the union, I said, well, it's the best one we've got. I said, the only thing worse than being in a union is not. It is frustrating being in an organisation when you feel they're not doing enough, etc., particularly if you're quite principled. And again, I think it comes down to individuals to say, is this something I want to be a part of or not?
Yeah.
It is a difficult one, particularly when you come to the reality of like political power in a first past the post system. And you get people who say, well, I might vote Labour or I'll vote strategically, even though my principles are at loggerheads with some of their key concerns. Now, what would you say to someone who says, well, I'm going to vote Labour even though I've got concerns because they're the only party likely to form government, or I'm going to vote tactically because it's very important to get the Conservatives out of power? What are your opinions on
I've been around that block with Blair once. I was very actively involved, in spite of the fact that I felt like leaving the Labour Party long before I did, in trying to get the Tories out of office. And what we saw was more of the same and worse. Margaret Thatcher herself is quoted as saying that her greatest achievement was New Labour. And I believe that if you vote for Starmer, you're getting Blair and Mandelson back as the grandees of Starmer's Labour Party. And that there is effectively, you are not actually voting for a party that's got any different policies or has any different allegiances in terms of the relationship between the many and the few as the one that you're voting out of office. And I'm also extremely concerned, getting back to the glass half empty aspect of things, that lately we've seen in the American presidential elections people voting for somebody because of who they weren't rather than who they were. And the same thing appears to be about to happen in this country. A lot of people don't think that Starmer is the charismatic leader that Blair was, apart from the fact we've already had a dose of that sort of thing in 97. We've got to get away from this negativity, voting for the lesser of two evils. They're both still evils. And we've seen that with Palestine.
Would you say, though, that it's better to have a lesser evil than a more pronounced evil? I know a lot of it's opinion.
I don't think evil, once it becomes evil, is divisible in terms of it, the extent of it.
But, I mean, if we looked at history and said Hitler, Mussolini, Trump, Biden, the Conservative Party in 94 compared with the Labour Party in 98. I'm deliberately going before Iraq War. There are sometimes decisions that have to be made where you say, I will accept the lesser of two evils, even though you might say, I want to drive the Overton window more to the left, or I'm going to stand on principle, or I'm going to resign. But I think morally, is it not better to choose the lesser of two evils at times?
I go back to the early days of the early decades of the 20th century, and you could have argued that about the Liberals and the Tories, but it didn't stop Keir Hardie bringing the Labour Party into Parliament as a new alternative. And I think we're at that stage now where we need a moral rearmament in terms of the Labour Party having failed to be or ceased to be anything like a vehicle for the expression of the aspirations of the majority.
Would you say, though, that the Liberal government, of the early 20th century, at the time, the Liberals and the Labour Party agreed, right, we won't stand against each other in certain elections. The lesser of two evils is still an important part of political strategy, even if you are driving in another direction personally yourself.
Well, we had... I'm not advocating that people vote for Labour because they want the Tories out. Yeah. Because I wouldn't be standing as an independent if it did. But I think you've got to accept that there are instances where a pragmatic alliance is the only option. I don't think we're in that situation, but it is potentially the only option you've got in other circumstances. And the principal example of that I would think of is the relationship that developed between the Soviet Union and the Allies during the Second World War to stop Hitler and stop the rise of fascism and Nazism.
Yeah. I think that's a nice breakthrough, because what you're saying is, there are times you need to be pragmatic and the lesser two, but you can still have your principles. You live your life, you think of the groups that you join, and you can try and influence things. along those lines, and that's why you're standing in Sefton Central. Sorry.
Yeah, for the moment, we've got the luxury of having the alternative perspective that can come through the ballot box. And I would like to think that I'm in the van of circumstance with regards to that, and that I bring a lifetime's experience of the first past the post system and having benefited from it electorally as an individual. Not that I'm a careerist, but I got elected to public office for what I suppose I would have regarded as the lesser of two evils, because to me the economic system that we live under is the ultimate master of our fates, and that fundamentally needs to change. But the Labour Party operates within the current bourgeois democratic system, and I was proud to have been part, as a functionary of that, to have been part of a movement towards change. It went away from the Tories under Thatcher and Major.
It's interesting as well, that kind of historical perspective on things, whereby I'm sure hunter-gatherers couldn't really imagine anything other than a hunter-gatherer society.
Yeah, good point.
Under the feudal system. I can almost imagine Jacob Rees-Mogg, great, whatever, sitting on his horse with the glasses on during the feudal system, watching the serfs, agrarian revolutions, the industrial revolutions. Like when Karl Marx wrote his books, the world has changed significantly since then. And I often say this to people who say, oh, you're not a Marxist, are you, or a communist? I say, well, I might not describe myself as a Marxist or a communist. I said, but I can look at ideas and think what's going on. Marx's diagnosis of what industrial society was like was absolutely spot on. His advocation, I've had disagreements with left-wing groups who say, oh, Marx and Engels advocated scientific analyses of history, and that's better, isn't it, if we've got that? I go, yeah, but Marx didn't really explain what that was going to look like. In many ways, he was kind of leaving that argument to other people, wasn't
That tends to be Marxists who say that. I mean, Marx was full of remarks. Like, one of the Marx's remarks was, one thing I'll never be is a Marxist. Because he wasn't into that sort of rigidity of label theory.
Well, Chomsky says the same thing. Like, he says, if someone says, oh, I'm a Marxist, say, what does that mean? Like, that you reject everything else, that you agree with the pure principles of what Marx said, whatever he meant. And then you've got the people who say that they're Marxists, who then add stuff to what Marx said and update it or whatever. And then you go, well, are you with them? Or it's ridiculous.
Well, you have this phenomenon throughout history. I mean, people saying about prophets or Jesus or whoever. It's open to interpretation by subsequent scholars or people who profess to be interpreters of the Holy Writ.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you look at these kind of things, I said to someone who believes in, strict Marxism, I said, well, what is strict Marxism? They were having a go at Karl Popper. I'm not a big fan of Karl Popper, but I think what Popper said, and I agree with him, he said, if there's an ideology that claims to know the truth, it almost becomes like a religion in itself, like these fundamentalist religions, fundamentalist ideologies, where someone is so rigid that you go, well, wait there, have you thought about this or that opinion?
Yeah.
And Marx's critique of industrialised capitalism in the 19th century was groundbreaking. He really got to the heart of things. But his plans for what came next, he was quite loose with that.
Yeah.
And then people have abused that, like Stalin.
Marx also said men must make history, but never, well, say men, you couldn't use that phrase politically correctly now, but using the generic for mankind, men must make history, but never under conditions of their own choosing.
Yeah.
And the stage on which it's played out changes over time, particularly with technology.
But moving forward now, I mean, you've got like Biden in his last, during his current presidency, huge infrastructure investments in the United States towards things like green technology, etc. This kind of we need to accept the limitations of what free market economics offers, and the state needs to show direction. So, for example, I don't know if you've read Harari's book, A Brief History of Homo Sapiens. He's like a bit of a vegan. He looks at industrial farming and goes, ethically, is this defensible?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. He says that's something we need to move beyond. There's interesting things now about artificial meat, etc. Hi everyone, we just had a little break. Welcome to part 2, but it's going to be much shorter now, Rav, because I know you've got to go and campaign.
Yes.
Now, You're standing as an independent in Sefton Central. Do you want to
You
tell
got
us
it
a
right
little bit
this
about
time,
that?
yeah. It was a last-minute decision, partly precipitated by the snap election, and partly because I realised that, to the best of my understanding, there were no progressive parties, either individuals or organisations, standing against the current Labour MP. Now, given that I have a personal interest in this, for having been the first Labour councillor in Crosby proper, and given that I am completely and utterly disgusted with the performance of Starmer and his minions, of whom the local MP is one, I decided that I had no option morally, in spite of my age and the fact that I've got a number of illnesses, but to throw my counterweight, if you like, for democratic purposes, into the mix.
There's, according to Wikipedia, you're not on there yet, we've got Conservative Reform UK, Labour, Bill Esterson, the current incumbent, and then we've got Green, Liberal Democrats, Workers' Party. You're going to be in there as well.
Yes.
Are you not worried that there's a bit of division there on that kind of more progressive side?
I think there's sufficient policy difference between me and the other, as you say, relatively progressive elements for me to still think that there is a need for me to stand. Also, I have a track record of having taken a seat off the Tories and been very heavily involved in Labour during Corbyn's watch, taking Ainsdale in the north, which is now part of Sefton Central. So in terms of campaigning ability, apart from anything else, I feel that my input would be probably more dynamic than the other progressive parties, if that doesn't sound too arrogant.
There was an issue in Southport in the last election where Labour and Liberals had a split vote, although Labour came a very close second and it allowed Damien Moore in, the Conservative MP. Obviously, you wouldn't want that to happen in Sefton Central. Are you not worried? You're not concerned about... I know the Conservatives, I don't think they're going to get wiped out, I think, in this general election, or not count me chickens. You're not worried about any right-wingers winning particular seats where there's divide, not necessarily in Sefton Central.
I think part of the problem is that people will vote Labour because of loyalty to what they think Labour is. And I would say that I am much closer to people's perception of what Labour should be than the incumbent.
Now, I'm in the Labour Party still, and my view is I'm giving money to the Labour Party each month because of the current Conservative government. And again, what you said is glass half empty, half full. I accept that criticism of that. We have both expressed concerns about the way Labour is run locally in Bootle, and I've spoken about this with other people as well. And similar family surnames. You can put a rocking horse up in Bootle and people will vote Labour locally, etc. What's your experience of the local Labour Party in Bootle? At council level?
Without wishing to get into litigation, too many people appear to be related to too many other people. I believe this is one local expression of a general problem with the restructuring, particularly under Blair and Mandelson, of the internal workings of the Labour Party. It's what I would call a vertical power dyad from the top down, from Starmer down, because what you've got now is we say jump and you say how high. They've altered the internal structure of the Labour Party. They've done away with the District Labour Party, which was a check and balance from the laity against the activities of the elected members, who have, after all, theoretically got a vested interest once they get elected. And you've now got, I believe, far too much control of the activity of the Labour Party at local ward level, at constituency level. I'm talking about the ordinary members now, not the elected members. But the elected members tend to do the work within the ward now and take officerships, and it's anti-democratic. Also, they would appear control over access to the panel. So anybody who has got, as it were, dissident opinions isn't going to get to be selected as a candidate in the first place if they're not talking the right speak.
Yeah, and I think my experience of going to local meetings, and it's very hard to make any inroads into examining what is currently going on. It's very much they'll close down discussion and debate, and they'll win votes with people turning up with similar surnames. I might edit that little bit out, and I might edit...
How you managed to not talk yourself out of with that sort of thinking, leaving the Labour Party as I've done, I don't know.
Well, again,
it's
just purely down to the national picture. And I think what's happened the last 14 years has been truly terrible.
Yes.
I mean, I'm critical of the Iraq war under Blair. I think he let power go to his head. Anyone who goes into a room in late 2002 and gets talked around by George Bush Jr., I mean, what was it like? Because he was in the office and, oh, wow, you know, I'm really important. I just don't understand that. My opinion of politicians is that every now and again you need a clean sweep, even if it's the same party. And I've used this quote before with you that Mark Twain said, politicians and underwear need to be replaced regularly for the same reason. And if you said to me that the local Labour Party would be replaced by newer people, not all of them, and who makes that decision?
I don't believe that the mechanism exists now for people who are new people to get near any of the levers of power. That's the problem.
But under Athenian democracy, there were sometimes times where you'd pick a lot and you'd say, like, you're serving for a certain amount of time. Then we'd pick another lot and that person comes in. You've got citizen assemblies. So, for example, with the recent crisis in children's services in Sefton, could we not, like, get a citizens' assembly of 12 people with varying experience, just randomly selected to come together and make decisions about what happens with that, rather than relying on...
I believe that any mechanisms that reintroduce a greater element of grassroots democracy, which has disappeared, as I say, vertical power dyads, we say jump, you say how high, anything that would offset that. I mean, the American Constitution was built very mindful of that problem of a particular clique getting a monopoly. That's why you've got the checks and balances of the Senate and the presidency. And
it's an incredible constitution. I know there's a
lot
of...
We haven't got one. We're subjects of the Crown. We're not citizens.
No, in the US example, it's incredible constitution how it was written. And the debates they had, the intellectual debates... But also, I mean, you talk about, like, taking land off the natives and slavery and all that, and some tremendous principles. But if in many ways it was designed to stop what happened in Europe happening in the United States. And in many ways, the Constitution, certainly in the first term, I don't think they ever predicted someone like Trump coming to power. But it did very much keep him in check. I mean... Whether he's going to come in all...
Ironically, I have to say, in defence of an institution which I found in principle indefensible, the unelected House of Lords, I've been bloody glad to see the Lords intervene in the short term because of some of the excesses of the Commons.
Well, again, I think that's down to populism, isn't it? And I've said this before, there's a difference between being popular and being populist.
Yes.
Populist is when you use a simple message that doesn't accord with reality and... blame some kind of elite and then a false elite, or let's just focus on this side of the elite, blame them for all the problems, and then you can get away with whatever you want.
Can I just make two quotes from Voltaire? One of which is, the price of democracy is eternal vigilance, and that means grassroots involvement all the time, to me. And the other thing is, if you want to know who's in charge, ask who's above criticism. I mean, it's not just North Korea.
Yeah. Voltaire's remarkable, wasn't he? I mean, he was actually quite conservative in many ways. But
well,
today...
Another example is Edmund Burke, who was one of the founders of the Conservative Party, whose legendary phrase has passed into common folklore. All that's necessary for a great evil to succeed is that good men should do nothing. Yeah.
And again, he was referring to the French Revolution. But... that has become something which you could apply to so many other things. But Burke was good about being an MP, said that your conscience matters more than...
Absolutely. I happen to agree with the use of the term, my right honourable friend. It's just that they haven't got any bloody honour anymore.
I think the other thing as well is, since 20... I know the Lords were unhappy with some of Cameron's reforms on cuts to, was it tax credits, etc., and that was the first time I thought the Lords have stood up there against something that the Lords are actually coming at something from a more progressive angle.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in many ways, with populist governments, which is what we've had, the Lords has been almost a guarantor of parliamentary sovereignty, liberty and accountability ahead of the House of Commons.
Again, it's a question of checks and balances, and that's why I want PR in some form.
And don't forget, it literally... because of our lack of a written constitution, any government in 2 days...
We're subject to the crown, as I said earlier. We're not citizens, and that needs examination. I think with the previous Queen, she was that well adapted to her position, whatever I thought of the institution, and she was from a generation of deference that doesn't exist anymore, that her passing represents a watershed situation. Yeah. It's no wonder she didn't abdicate, because the present king hasn't got what it takes.
Yeah. Even though we might agree with some of your principles.
Well, he talks to plants as well.
I think that's a good place to end. Right, that's coming in at 1 hour and 3. So Ralph is standing in Sefton Central as an independent because of his concerns over the current running of the Labour Party, their political position. We've been round the houses today. We've spoken about animal rights, first past the post and the voting system. We've spoken about so much. I'll do a little list of it, I think, in the podcast notes. But Ralph, been great to talk to you. We need to talk again about animal rights and I think your dad's experiences of World War II.
He had the most amazing war.
And then what
if you
we
can call
spoke
a war
about
amazing.
I've been meaning to do a second podcast on the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I did one about 18 months ago. And I've read 3 books since then about the Holocaust, which I want to let people know about.
I have been there.
And in that context, I think we can share it. When I went there, it was one of the most profound experiences.
Yeah, me too.
I could literally, I felt something.
Yeah.
It was incredible. It's something which I think is part of the moral makeup of people like you and me, where you're thinking about individual
absolutely.
morality.
One of the things that I couldn't understand why I was having the feelings I was feeling, because I was told there was a psychic wall round the place and no birds sang. The opposite was true. There were birds mating, there was ducks, pigeons cooing, and what I realised was that nature had reasserted itself, and it was a lesson in humanity not trying to play God.
Yeah. But yeah, I think ultimately the gates of Auschwitz symbolically,
yeah,
I think, without trying to sound too grandiose here, I think about that day to day. I think about what would it have been like if I'd have been around then.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to say, oh, then people went along with it, even if it was by just not getting involved. I think it links to what we discussed earlier about how morality and ethics can be part of your day-to-day life. You know what I mean? And how you should live the good life, as it were. It
is, whether you recognise it or not. It's a form of disenfranchisement to be part of a culture which doesn't nourish your awareness of that.
Yeah. And I think the personal is the political.
Absolutely.
Everything we do every day is completely political. And people who try to say that that isn't the case, they're doing that for a reason. I think that's part of
which is political.
Which is political. I think as well as that, trying to discourage people from going on to further and higher education and do useless degrees.
Throughout life.
It certainly makes people more compliant.
Absolutely.
Right, let's end it there.
Yep.
Ralph, it's been a pleasure. And
likewise, it's been a privilege, Tim.
Cheers, mate. Thanks.